Someone asked me a little while ago why I specifically use the colours that I do and why I have a fairly narrow range of colours. So I thought what we'd do is go into a little bit of colour theory, but not as you know it. And I'm going to focus particularly on three colours which I think are incredibly versatile, and we're going to explore a range of them, and you can sort of see how simple it becomes rather than sort of complicating things with too many colours. Hi, I'm Mark Waller, and I reckon the world is full of magic, so I've been painting it. And this channel is all about me sharing those discoveries that I've made of painting, but also of all that magic. So what we'll do is we'll be focusing in on mainly on the foliage, so all of this stuff in here, and we'll be looking at how those colours kind of play together to create the illusion of cool shadows and highlights on trees and things like that. So I've found this old print, and what I've done is I've prepped it up with a product called binder medium, and I've gone over it with a couple of coats of impasto gel, and that will lock in anything that's underneath it, and then I can paint over the top of that, and that's kind of my prep. And I mention that because it's amazing what you'll find in op shops and things sometimes, which are great for doing exercises and stuff, so keep your eyes open. But now we're going to do an exercise using those recipes and modifying them, you know, by adding colours here and there to change the appearance of trees in the distance or closer or in the sunlight. So that will all happen in here. So I've dished out some white, some permanent alizarin, some cadmium yellow medium, cadmium yellow light, forest green, phthalo blue, French ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and burnt umber. And everything will be spinning off this forest green. So I love forest green because it's an incredibly versatile colour. I can warm it up, I can cool it down, I can add colours to it to push it away or bring it closer. And that's what we'll be doing now. So forest green will be our central point, and then we'll go off in different directions with that by adding warm colours and cool colours to create the illusion of distance and foliage and things. So I've got forest green neat here, and I'm just literally going to slap it down like that, and it doesn't matter if it's a little bit skinny here and there. By the time we put a few layers of paint over that, most of that will be hidden. And there we go. That'll do us for the moment. So what I want to do now is I want to create the impression of the tops of these trees really receding off into the distance. And I've used French ultramarine blue up here. So I'm going to push some French ultramarine blue and white into this forest green, and that will create the impression of the trees disappearing away. So I've got my forest green, and I'm stealing a little bit of white there and adding some French ultramarine blue to make it look further away. Okay, and that should get me out of trouble. So now I'm just going to brush that colour in there and mix it all up. I want it to be sort of indistinct, so it looks a little bit as though there's trees in the background, a few gaps in the trees. And I'm going to now repeat that same process, add a little bit of white and some French ultramarine blue. So I'm going to make a colour that's right deep in the shadows and nice and cool in the rainforest. So it's basically, I'm just adding phthalo blue to the forest green, and you can see that that's darkened that up nicely. And I'm just going to put that in there, here and there strategically, just to kind of create the impression of the darkness receding off into the distance in the forest. And I'll quite often come back and do this later, but this is, go over this later, but this is really just to get a sense of the exercise and how we can build on forest green to create the illusion of depth and interest. You may or may not be aware of this, but for all the primaries generally we have a warm and a cool version. And so what I'm doing here is I'm using the warmer version to create the impression of things coming forward or things being more in the light, and the cooler colours I'm adding to the forest green to create the illusion of probably a little more shade and deeper in the forest. So we'll be oscillating sort of between the warms and the cools a lot here. And so this exercise is about creating highlights by adding the warm colours and creating lovely deep shadows by using the cooler colours. So I'm getting a little bit of forest green here now. I'm adding some Dioxazine Purple to that to warm it up a little bit. And I'm adding a little bit of Cadmium Yellow Medium to that because I want it to stay fairly warm still. And that is one of the recipes I use in my recipe book. Okay, so now I'm just going to, with that colour, just sort of mix up the brush strokes. And you can actually do this if you want to by lying the canvas flat on the floor and just splattering some paint on it. And I'm just going to mix up that here and there, create the impression of branches and trees and not too stressed. You might be able to see that I'm kind of loosely making these shapes in towards the centre. Create the impression of shrubbery and a fairly rough bush track. So I'm just adding a little bit of Cadmium Yellow Medium to that. And just repeat. And remember, this is just an exercise to play with that whole warm to cool concept and whole idea of using this forest green as a sort of a pivoting colour or a colour to kind of pivot the whole painting off. So I'm just using the tip of the brush here and kind of pushing fairly hard to let it fold over, and as it folds over, it sort of creates those lovely scraggly broken effect. So hopefully we should be able to see there's a path going up into the bush here, or up into the bush here, and these are sort of the shrubs and the trees and the scrub that sort of frame the path as it recedes off into the distance. And we will paint some, highlights on the path and bits and pieces later. So I'm going to put some highlights on there, and I'm just going to add a bit more yellow to that. I'm using a smaller brush now just to sort of create the illusion of leaves and things. And so now I'm just going to use that sort of brush stroke like that just to suggest shrubbery. A little tip with that too, if you make these highlights follow a sort of an arc like that, you tend to make all of the bush a little thicker. But we want to make this bush look a little bit sort of so you can see through the leaves and things. So what we're going to do is we'll break up the leaves and the brush strokes a little bit so that it's more open. You can see light coming through here and there. And you can see, look, I'm really just letting the brush do a lot of this. This is sort of a really fun little impressionist exercise. It's more about colour really, if the truth be told. At some point I'll have to go away and have a coffee and let that paint dry. So while this is still a bit wet, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get a little bit of burnt umber and just run some rough tree trunks through there, so I've got an idea of illusion of depth and distance, and then I'll come back later on and put some bits and pieces over the top. But this is just to give me a bit of structure, and I'm happy for the burnt umber to meld into this wet paint a little bit, because then it'll kind of create the impression of being able to see tree trunks in the distance. So we're moving away from the green for a minute. Just grabbing a little bit of burnt umber. Just going to add a touch of water to it so it travels a little bit. Perfect. I'm just going to use the edge of the brush and just roll through here and there like that, just to create the impression of, you know, branches in the distance. And you'll notice I'm breaking those brush strokes up. This part's not that important, it's more just for a little bit of structure. And we'll go away and let it dry for a bit. So while I've got this burnt umber, I'm just going to run it through here and there like that, just to create the impression of some planes. We won't use that grey that's underneath, but it kind of looks cool. And that should now create the impression of maybe, you know, bits and pieces of bark lying on the ground. And we'll just push that out like that, just to create the impression of maybe some highlights on the path. Again, it's all very impressionistic, so we're not going to worry too much about making it neat. But you know, even that always even excites me, because I can just see that path now kind of opening up into the bush, and eventually we'll add some highlights to that here and there and create the impression of dappled light filtering through. So I've pretty much stayed with my forest green and just sort of branched off a little bit using the forest green by adding little colours to make it sort of warmer and cooler and things. So we're just going to keep doing the same thing with a smaller brush, just to kind of create the illusion of more shrubbery and sort of broken stuff. But we'll keep playing with that, and it's surprising how layered and effective just staying close to that forest green is, and just going into the warms and then into the cools. So I'm going to mix up some really darks now. So you can see here I've got that forest green, and I mixed some phthalo blue with that. So I'm going to mix a little bit more phthalo blue, but I'm also going to pinch a little bit of alizarin, and alizarine's a nice cool red, but hopefully it'll darken it up nicely so I can get some more darks in there like that. And again, we're staying with the forest green and then moving into the darks. So I'm just going to get in here like that and break up some of that shrubbery, create a few more shadows here and there. It just sort of defines the bush a little bit more. I can put a few shadows on the bottom of some of those clusters of trees up here and there. Give them a little bit of volume. And that should start to define sort of more layers, you know, off into the bush, and kind of create a bit more depth, and the idea of kind of light hitting different areas. And you can suggest light by creating shadows, of course. Okay, so I'm just going to get a little bit of forest green and put it there, and I'm just going to add some white to that. Because what I want to create the impression of is leaves in the shaded area of the bush, so there's no light on them per se, just maybe a little bit of reflected light. So down here in the shadows, I'm just going to put a few highlights here and there, and eventually what will happen is we'll put some highlights, some more highlights here and there in this picture, and that will create the illusion of the dappled light filtering sort of through the trees and into the undergrowth underneath. And I'm sort of semi-being strategic with this. It's really just to create the impression of, you know, individual leaves being, you know, a bit of light bouncing off them, or a little bit of the sky reflecting off them here and there. But it's nice and cool, so it kind of gives that impression of, you know, leaves in the depths of the shadows. Maybe up here too a little bit, not so much, but and the beautiful thing about this process too is that because you're only working really with one colour and adding bits and pieces to it, you can always come back over it and hide little sins here and there, and it just really just adds to the illusion of depth. So I'm just getting some cadmium yellow light, and there's still a little bit of forest green in my brush, as you can see, and a little bit of white. And this is the colour that the leaves will make when they're being hit directly by sunlight. Okay, so I will start painting that in now. So I've used the cadmium yellow light because warmer colours, or cadmium yellow light is a cooler colour, but I've used that because the warmer colours are a little bit dirtier, and I want this lovely clean light of the light filtering through. And I'm going to actually just here and there do this because there'll be bits of grass and stuff like that that are being hit by the light, and making my brush strokes a bit smaller further away. I want to kind of get the sense of the light filtering through and hitting leaves here and there and grasses and stuff. Now I've gone pretty hard with this colour, and I'll come back in a minute and mix up a sort of a softer version of it. So in other words, adding a little bit more green and a little bit more yellow to it to create the impression, you know, of a transition from that starker sunlit colour through into a sort of a softer, more shaded colour. But if you pick out little areas like that, and you can actually do it in a line too sometimes, so it looks like light's coming through into the bush. Yeah, it's a little jarring when you see how strong this colour is, but when I soften it up in a minute, it'll make a bit more sense. It's not a bad idea to, you know, you can let the paint diminish itself on the brush and then make more subtle marks. So when it's strong over there, and as the paint diminishes, I'll make some softer marks. I'm putting a little bit strategically these flashes of light here. I'm putting them in the gaps in the trees here because it makes it then look like the branches are disappearing behind a little bit of foliage. And of course there'd be much more of that colour up the top here, higher up in the canopy. Now the paint's diminished itself off this brush enough for me to come back in here and start just softening that transition out a little bit. So I'm just going to steal a little bit of white and a little bit of burnt umber. I just need a little bit of burnt umber. That's a little bit dull, but we're going to extrapolate the burnt umber and the white in a minute in the same way that we did with the forest green, but I just want to get a bit of colour down now. Again, some more structure. So I'm just going to, here and there, put a little bit of light on the floor of the path. turn that path off in around the corner there. And I'm going to, you may or may not notice this, but I'm actually making sort of a little line, almost like a line where there's highlights and where there's not, so that it kind of creates the impression of sort of shafts of light coming through the canopy. And as I come up onto the edge of the path there, I just break it up a little bit like that, so it's sort of suggests the, you know, bark and dirt going up into the bush. And while I have that colour, I'm going to just drop it down here like that, just using the edge of the brush to create the impression of more branches up in the canopy and disappearing off into the bush. This only needs to be really subtle because we'll come back and do a little bit more later. Okay, so I've got some forest green there. I'm going to take quite a lot of cadmium yellow medium. And that lovely cadmium yellow medium creates sort of the impression of leaves being backlit. And of course there'd be a lot of that in the bush. I'm not going to get too heavy-handed with it. I'm just going to here and there, especially where I've seen the light filter through, there'll be flashes of that somewhere around that. Because wherever light leaves are hit with direct sunlight, there'll almost certainly be one that's backlit somewhere around it. And it's just a pretty colour, let's be honest. I quite like that when you go into the bush and you look around and you can see all those lovely flashes of green, you know, and you can tell just by the colour of them whether it's a leaf that's backlit or whether it's the light hitting it, or get that lovely warm glow as the sun hits on the other side of it, and you can sort of see through it, see all the veins in it. And so much to see in the bush. Of course, that'll be up in the canopy as well. And I'm just mixing up the brush strokes, you can see. So the more of these sort of flecks of colour that I put in here, the more the canopy opens up, and the more formal I make them, or more structured, the denser the bush becomes. So by me putting these flecks of colour here and there, it makes the bush look a lot sort of thinner, and there's a lot more light filtering through it. I'm just adding a little bit more yellow to that, sticking with my OCD 3 incremental shifts of colour. And again, just exactly the same thing. A little bit more intense in the areas where there's light filtering through, and gradually spreading it out. And of course, much more of that up there in the canopy. So this is the original highlight colour, and I'm just going to add a lot more white to that. And a touch more cad yellow light. And away we go. Okay, so now with that colour, I'm just going to come back onto all my highlights. I'm just going to be a little more careful with it. Just want that lovely idea of, you know, sunlight dropping down through the trees and hitting leaves and bouncing up. Now, I'm just going to, where these patches of white are, that's clearly where there's sunlight. So I'm just going to put highlights there like that. And hopefully that should give those, place some of that bush a little bit better. And again, obviously lots of light up here in the canopy. It'll go hard and there'll be the odd leaf here and there that a bit of light's hitting. A bit strong, some of them. That's why my shirts are always covered in paint. Sometimes with these highlights, you can see how the branches are coming out this way. I'm just going to run the highlights so they kind of mirror that shape a little bit, because then it looks like the trees are radiating out from a central trunk. So while this has been an exercise that sort of shows the versatility of forest green and sort of verges a little bit into, you know, the concept of warm to cool and some colour theory, what we're going to do now is it is very green. So I'm just going to add a little bit of some flecks of oranges and things like that, you know, to create the illusion of dead leaves here and there. And we'll probably put a few more highlights to create the illusion of a little bit more light or sky being seen through the gaps in the trees. So I'm just getting a little bit of my permanent Alizarine and a little bit of my Cad Yellow medium. And that can be a nice dead leaf colour. And what I'm going to do while I've got plenty of paint on the brush, I'm just going to drag the brush down here and there like that, just to create the impression of a little bit of light maybe hitting some of those branches up higher. Like that, down here. Just to warm it up a bit. And now I'm just going to, just here and there, do that. Just so we've got a bit of extra colour in there like that. I'm going to add a little bit of Dioxazine Purple to that, just to give me a nice reddy brown, and repeat the same thing basically very quickly. And now I'm going out the other way, adding a touch of white. And again, just sharpening up the trees a little bit here and there. And putting a bit more light and those patches on the sand, sorry, on the trail. Makes it a bit more interesting. Okay, I've grabbed a little bit of Dioxazine Purple there, and while this looks like a very extreme colour, and it kind of is, it's kind of fun to put in there, and it'll give it warm it up a bit and make the shadows a bit deeper. So first thing, I'll start off with a couple of tree trunks like that. Bam, look at that. Strong. Oops, too much. Take some of that colour off. Just for a bit of contrast. So while we did that, we used our forest green and we kind of worked out from there. We're going to do the same thing with burnt umber, because apparently someone not too far away is unhappy with the skinny little tree trunks. So the good news is that now I'm going to add some more to this by adding some bigger trees. And hopefully they'll get off my case. But we can do the same thing as we've done with the burnt umber, or sorry, as we did with the forest green, but we can do it with burnt umber. So using the burnt umber as kind of our go-to colour, and then pivoting everything off that. And this tree in the distance here, we'll put one in the distance, but we'll just break it up a little bit so it looks as though it's only just seen through the bush. And another one there. Big one at the end of the path. Make a nice big one there. Okay, so that's our foundation burnt umber tree. So what I'm going to do now is make it darker down one side, so I'm just going to add a bit of Dioxazine Purple to that, and that'll make it darker but warmer. Just run that down that edge, because we're assuming the sun's coming from this way. Like that. And I'm going to break it up a little bit just like that, because then it'll create the impression of nice rough bark. And now if I really wanted to sort of push up that, I'd add some Pthalo Blue to that to cool it down, and really run that down the shaded side of that tree. I'll just go through the motions just to show you what I mean. I'll just run that down there like that. And that will then create the impression of that side of the tree being very much in shadow. And here, and just break it up a bit like that. I'm just going to get a little bit of white now, oh sorry, burnt umber, and a touch of white. And that is going to be my lit side. And I'm just going to break that up a little bit like that, because I want it to be all nice barky and broken and rough. So I'll let that dry for a little minute and just put some highlights down the sides of that tree. But the thing about this exercise is that it shows how versatile forest green and burnt umber are. And in the same way that we radiated away from the green, we created the cools and the warms, we're doing exactly the same thing with the tree by going, into the Dioxazine Purple and then cooler Pthalo Blue. And going the other way, we just added white to that because burnt umber is already quite warm, so it doesn't need a lot of other colour to warm it up. But it just goes to show how adding those cooler colours creates that lovely idea of shade and depth, but then adding the warmer colours brings it more out into the light. So I'm just pinching some of that colour, which was that paler kind of orangey colour. I'm going to use that now to put highlights down the side of the tree. So now I'm just going to create the impression of the light shining through the canopy and hitting. Some of the tree, or just on that edge of the tree anyway. So I just pinched a little bit of that, trees in the background colour, and I'm just putting a few more spots here and there just to create the impression of being able to see through all the bush into the trees in the distance. Like that. Not taking a lot of care with that, but don't really need to. And now I'll just put a bit of sky through there to tidy that up and we're done. I've grabbed a little bit of French ultramarine blue and white, which was my original sky colour. And I'm just going to go through and strategically paint some holes in the bush. And you can kind of use that to shape the bush a little bit there, here and there if you want, or hide any blobs. So this exercise is about how versatile forest green is, and it's such a lovely colour because it's warm enough to push out into the highlights and things, and then it's also able to be cooled down enough to make lovely deep shadows. So I love forest green. You might actually be interested in the foliage video that's coming along next, and I'm sure you will be interested in our recipe book.